Over millennia, there have been many revolutionary ideas in naval warfare: floaty logs, triremes, Greek fire cannons, and dreadnoughts. However, not all ideas are created equal. Some were truly horrendous. Some have bad reputations for how they look, others because of how they perform. In terms of naval history, it seems like there are a lot of bad ideas, giving me plenty to talk about, and that's what we're going to do. In today's video, we're going to look at 3 weird and/or terrible naval ideas. Starting off, we're going to look at something weird and not necessarily terrible. Instead, a rather ingenious way to use old guns from outdated ships: the Royal Navy's monitors. Still, not just any monitors, the 9.2-inch monitors, M15 to M28. Like we do with these sorts of things, we'll take from Ian Buxton in Big Gun Monitors, 1914 to 1945, quote, "With the construction of the 15-inch, 14-inch, and 12-inch gun monitor classes well underway by early 1915, Fisher turned his attention to the possibility of obtaining further heavily armed vessels. The next largest caliber service gun was the 9.2-inch, fitted in a wide range of pre-dreadnoughts and cruisers. As it was usually installed in single mountings, the much lower weight compared with the heavy battleship twin mountings offered the chance of arming several small shallow draft monitors. A hasty search was instituted for available 9.2-inch mountings, as heavy mountings were always more scarce than guns. The 9.2-inch Mark X on a Mark V single mounting was an obvious candidate. 2 single mountings had been fitted in each of the 5 Cressy and Drake classes of armored cruisers of 1901. Still, already 3 of the ships had been lost during the war. Aboukir and Cressy torpedoed in the North Sea in September 1914, and Good Hope sunk at Coronel in November. Only 2 ships remained, fitted with the Ellswick Mark V mounting, Drake and Leviathan. All other ships of the classes had the Vickers Mark VI mounting. 1 spare mounting had been supplied for each ship, so 4 could be earmarked for new monitors and still have 1 spare between the 2 remaining ships." End quote. So like I mentioned before, these monitors had guns from older ships, including the Edgar class of 1893, and with those additional guns, it was possible to arm 10 more monitors. Now, it should be noted that there was a difference between the 2 9.2-inch guns being used. The Mark VI gun of these much older ships was a low-velocity gun with much less range than the newer Mark X Buxton discussed. But with a few adjustments from the Ellswick yard, the range could be adjusted, allowing the Mark VI to train to a much higher elevation than in the previous mounting. With the armament being selected, the detailed design work could begin for the hull and the machinery. The hull would be 170 feet long and 31 feet wide, to provide the needed stability for such a large gun on such a small ship, displacing some 540 tons, at least on paper. The hull was only a single deck deep, except forward under the raised forecastle, which housed most of the crew in very Spartan conditions. The gun was sighted aft of the break of the forecastle. Abaft the gun, the superstructure housed the officers, a few ratings, and the galley, with the bridge, mast, funnel, and 6-pounder high-angle gun being the only erections thereon. A single 12-pounder was sighted on the quarterdeck, below which its magazines plus various storerooms. The magazine of the 9.2-inch gun, support, and machinery occupied the midship's 50% of the main hull. Sadly, these monitors weren't equipped with the bulges we've become accustomed to and love so much. Now, when it came to the machinery, it was going to be interesting, as the first Sea Lord, Admiral John Jackie Fisher, wanted to use internal combustion engines whenever possible, and at that same time, a large order had been placed for X-lighters, landing barges, mostly having Bolinder's engines, so plans were drawn up to use these in the monitors. So the monitors were going to get a 4-cylinder 2-stroke M-type, developing 320 bhp. 2 were to be fitted in each monitor, giving them roughly 800 indicated horsepower. However, there weren't enough of these to go around, so some of the monitors received other machinery. The monitors were constructed in a relatively short period of time, with some delays due to extra gun mounts being found around Europe in places like Gibraltar or Malta. But by November 1915, the different groups of the monitors started their trials, Where to take from Buxton again, quote, gun and speed trials were carried out as quickly as possible, sometimes the same day. No major problems arose, although speed fell short of the expected 12 knots by up to 1 knot in the lower powered vessels. Deep displacement was rather greater than designed, averaging about 610 tons for the diesel Mark VI and 650 tons for the steam Mark X, increasing the mean draft by about 12 inches and giving a trim about 2 feet by the stern. The probable expenditure on each vessel was around 35,000 to 40,000 pounds, the diesel boats being the most expensive. The true cost would have been about 50 to 55,000 if the armament had not already been available. The monitors left their builders' yards as soon as they were ready, those destined for overseas service spending a week or two at one of the home dockyards to be fully equipped for such operations. These small monitors fought across various theaters. On the Western Front, as part of the Dover Command, where M15 was sunk by a U-boat, or in the Mediterranean assisting in the Gallipoli campaign, or in the Middle East. However, M28 has one of the most interesting tales as she was sunk along with HMS Raglan by the former German battlecruiser Goeben in 1918 in an ill-fated sortie. One of the most interesting places the monitors served was in Russia, in the British intervention. The monitors fought in the White Sea, where they served to bombard the Red Army as they advanced to capture those Arctic ports. The small 9.2-inch monitors were faster than earlier coal-burning ships, reaching around 9 to 10.5 knots compared to just 7 knots. However, they rolled quite badly due to the lack of bilge keels, and claims included M25 reaching around 45 degrees and M23 reaching around 57 degrees, likely exaggerated but still enough to throw ammunition from its racks. Bilge keels were later added, improving but not solving the issue. Their shallow draft hulls handled poorly in general. Diesel machinery failed to meet naval demands, struggling with frequent speed changes and causing fires in their funnels due to unburnt fuel igniting during reversals or after running at full power. Although their theoretical range was around 2,200 miles, unreliability meant that they were towed for long voyages. Steam monitors were also towed, not due to unreliability, but because they could steam for only about 3 days and had small bunkers despite consuming nearly 4 times more fuel than the diesels. The hulls were structurally light for their heavy gun and needed stiffening, especially on smaller monitors. So the monitors had some ups and downs, but were generally a fine gun platform and played a valuable role. Next, we have a rather interesting pair of ships, 2 Norwegian vessels turned into German flak ships during the Second World War. Basically, the Germans needed platforms to attach anti-aircraft guns to help defend the various port cities around the German homeland and the newly conquered territories. There were more captured vessels used by Germans, and next week we'll cover the rest of those captured ships. Still, a vast majority of these vessels were obsolete and outdated, especially the 2 Norwegian coastal defense ships, Tordenskjold and Harald Haarfagre, being upwards of 40 years old by the time that they were captured in the spring of 1940. Their age wasn't necessarily a problem, as they were in good condition and capable of self-propulsion and could serve the Kriegsmarine well in this flagship role. To take from Aidan Dodson and Dirk Nodelman, in their article from Warships 2023, they write, "At the time of the German invasion of Norway in April 1940, the largest ships of the Norwegian Navy were 4 coastal defense ships, built in pairs in the UK at the end of the 19th century. 2, Norge and Eidsvold, 1900, were sunk by German destroyers on the first day of the attack, April 9th, but the other pair, Tordenskjold and Harald Haarfagre, were captured intact, laid up at Horten Dockyard, and later that same day, both were taken in hand for conversion to anti-aircraft vessels. Still, as the machinery was in good order, both would be capable of self-propulsion, and would have perhaps the most prominent part in the war of all the conversions. The 2 ships were laid down in the late 19th century and had 21cm, 12cm, and 76cm guns, with machinery to make around 17 knots. They weren't bad ships, just old. They served in a variety of roles until the outbreak of war, where they were captured in the spring of 1940. Being virtually undamaged, the ships were selected for conversion work into flak ships during the summer of 1940, with the work beginning in October. Tordenskjold became the Nymphe, and Haarfagre became the name Thetis. And thank God I can use these names now, because the Norwegian language is insane. Anyway, the ships recommissioned into German service in February 1941. All existing armaments were removed, and single 10.5cm 45 caliber guns were placed on the forecastle and quarterdecks as in Arkona and Medusa, another two ships we discussed previously. Being larger vessels from the outset, Nymphe and Thetis carried two more guns of this caliber in superimposed positions. According to the original plans, there were to be 8 short-barreled 4cm cannons of an unknown origin, 4 replacing the original 12cm weapons, and 4 abreast the bridge. But in the event of similar short-barreled 2cm guns were planned to be substituted in all but 2 cases. This would be amended shortly after more modern German AA guns of the same caliber were placed. Directors with 3-meter rangefinders were planned to be fitted atop the original bridgework and on top of a platform on the cut-down mainmast. These were certainly fitted in Thetis, but photos of Nymphe made it unclear if she ever carried them. Tall lattice structures fore and aft of the funnel were shortened by 2 meters. Each originally supported a single searchlight. Still, the forward model was later exchanged for a pair of smaller side-edged units in Nymphe. Taking from Dodson and Nodelman again. A major difference between the sisters, as converted, was that Thetis had a tripod mast installed aft of the funnel, a feature never present in Nymphe. Also, the latter did not have the shelter deck built out to the ship's sides abreast the funnel. In Thetis, the shelter deck extension supported the ship's boats. In Nymphe, these were carried out on davits. At the end of her career, Nymphe had her forward lattice structure significantly heightened, presumably to receive radar, although it is uncertain whether this was ever installed. Her after lattice structure was shortened at the same time, probably as top weight compensation. These modifications were not carried out in Thetis, although the forward searchlight platform was empty at the end of the war. Information on the careers of the two ships is incomplete, with some confusion regarding their individual histories, so take what I say with a grain of salt. Thetis is generally reported to have joined Marine Flak Oppteilung 709 based at Horstad, Norway, but from the outset, several images taken at different times indicate by changing in her camouflage scheme contradict this. Most images instead show her at Kiel, while another source claims that she was employed at Flensburg from February 1941, protecting the Naval Academy as well as the town and local shipyard against air raids coming from the Flensburg Fjord. This deployment seems to have lasted until December 1942, with a confirmed stint at Kiel in October, when Thetis was reported to have been located at Kristiansand, Norway, finally on her way north. Nymphe was first reported as having been attached to Marine Flak Oppteilung 214 at Kiel, which may reflect a mix-up in names. However, what is certain is that in May 1942, she was transferred to Norway to join Marine Flak Oppteilung 710 at Tromsø. Her first station was in the Oslofjord near Narvik, where she helped defend the anchorage at Bogan Bay. When Tirpitz shifted her anchorage from Bogan Bay to the fleet anchorage at Oslofjord during 1943, both Nymphe and Thetis were redeployed there to provide anti-aircraft cover. Their strong flak batteries played a vital role during the British midget submarine raid in September 1943, which caused severe shock damage and temporarily disabled much of Tirpitz's main battery. After Scharnhorst's loss in December 1943, Thetis was stationed for a time at Skillinfjord, opposite Sternsund, positioned to use her rapid-firing guns against any small craft that might try to enter Altafjord through the narrow passage. Ultimately, in October 1944, both Thetis and Nymphe moved with Tirpitz to Tromsø, but they were unable to stop the battleship's destruction in the bombing of November 12, 1944. Despite claims in some sources, both vessels were named in northern Norway at the time of Germany's surrender. Nymphe was lying at Svolvær when Norwegian authorities ordered her to Narvik, carrying her German crew along with troops from the Luften Islands to surrender formally. Shortly after sailing, however, on May 17, 1945, she was deliberately sabotaged by a reportedly drunken German crew, who opened several seacocks, forcing her to beach at Kuna Meloy. She sank in shallow water with her upper deck awash. In 1948, she was sold to be broken up, raised, and scrapped there. One of her anchors is preserved today outside Lofton War Memorial Museum in Svolvær. Thetis, meanwhile, ended the war near Horstadt, where she was present during the May 4, 1945 bombing of the harbor and Operation Judgment. She was returned intact to Norwegian control, served briefly as an accommodation ship, and in 1947 was sold to be scrapped, being dismantled the following year. Finally, we have some actually terrible ships, Kawachi and Setsu, Japan's first attempt at fully entering the dreadnought era, and they face-planted right out of the gate. Japanese battleship development generally followed the Royal Navy. The previous Katori class looked a lot like the British King Edward VII class. Then came Satsuma and Aki, semi-dreadnoughts with 12 10-inch guns, and wing turrets and a standard pre-dreadnought mix of secondaries. But as Catherine Milanovic writes in the 2017 edition of Warships, quote, "In the next two ships, Kawachi and Setsu, the intermediate guns were suppressed altogether and replaced by 8 12-inch guns, for a total of 12 main guns. The uniform main armament reflected that of a contemporary British dreadnought. However, the barrels of the guns mounted in the two centerline turrets had a length of 50 calibers, while those mounted in the wing turrets, 2 per side, were 45 caliber in length. This meant that while they were technically all big gun ships, the lack of uniformity in the length of the guns meant that they could not be considered true dreadnoughts. The trajectory of the shells fired from the barrels of the different lengths are not identical, and this rendered fire control more difficult. Kawachi and Setsu also differed from dreadnought in the retention of secondary batteries of 6-inch guns, and in the division of the light guns into the 4.7-inch and 3-inch calibers." End quote. So yes, they had 12-inch guns, but a dreadnought that couldn't coordinate its main battery was already a failure. The rest of the world was moving much faster. When the Japanese laid these two down in 1909, the United States was working on the Michigan class with superimposed centerline turrets. Britain was building the Orion class of super dreadnoughts with 13.5-inch guns, all in the center line, all able to fire on both broadsides. Meanwhile, Japan produced ships where only 8 of the 12 guns could fire on the broadside, the way naval battles were actually fought. Yes, they could fire 6 ahead or astern, but no one cared. That was tactically minor at best. The design was essentially a cheaper, patched-up version of Aki, with bigger guns and a thicker belt. But budget limits meant bad compromises. Milanovic again explains, quote, "Kondo, the designer, submitted substantially the same proposals as before, but favored a ship with 6 twin 12-inch turrets, of which 2 pairs were superimposed fore and aft, and the other 2 were in echelon amidships. However, this required an increase in displacement of 3,000 tons, making it impossible to build the new ships within the limits of 20,000 tons. Therefore, in comparison to the preceding class, improvements were limited to a uniform caliber for the main battery, with 8 instead of 12 guns on the broadside, but a heavier weight of shell, and the suppression of the midship wing turrets." End quote. The Japanese Navy knew how to do it right, they just wouldn't pay for it. The result was a compromised design that sat nowhere good. And if their firepower was already lacking, their engineering made things worse. The turbines were too large, and the distance between the shaft bearings too long. When the shafts weren't running, they bent. When they were running, they overheated the bearings. This was considered a major flaw in their propulsion. So when Kawachi and Setsu finally entered service in 1912, they were behind in layout, behind in guns, and behind in reliability. Japan managed to build dreadnoughts that were already obsolete and actively bad on the day they hit the water. Well, what do you think about the ships on our list? Some are good, some are bad, and some are up for debate. The 9.2-inch monitors, I think, were an inventive way to get more big guns into the theater of war, but they certainly had their issues. The same goes for the flak ships, but I think they were just weirder more than anything else. While Kawachi and Setsu certainly had some weird features, they were generally not great ships due to the shortcomings of the Japanese shipbuilding industry and the economic circumstances they found themselves in. Anyway, let me know what you think about these ships in the comments below. Please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.